Mrs. Somtochukwu had just gotten a massive promotion to the position of a director in her company. It was such a coveted position that had many eyes on it. The interviews to select the best hand for the job had been a grueling one. Mr. Somtochukwu had helped his wife out many times when she couldn't do her chores at home because of the studies she had to do for her several interviews. Three other people who were in the same level as her at work had been her strong opponents, but her past constant certifications had helped giving her an edge. Fortunately, she got the position. There was massive celebration for her as her junior workers, friends, her husband, and his friends had organized small parties for her at different locations. It was such a happy time for her. Her husband was happy for her. Mr. Somtochukwu runs a petty business in the street. His wife has always earned more than him, but he doesn't fail in his financial duties, an act his wife respected him for. Though there were times she threw tantrums on how the amount he dropped for feeding wasn't enough, they had no other issues. Mrs. Sumpter commenced work the next week. The promotion had come with free accommodation in a staff quarters. Mrs. Sumpter had always looked forward to living in the quarters, which had all the comfort that made a home interesting. She told her husband about it, and to her dismay, he had refused vehemently. He said it was tantamount to him living in his wife's house. There was nothing Mrs. Sumpter didn't say to pacify him. She told him the house was close to the company and it would make her growing responsibilities in the office easier to bear, as she would get busier and might need to stay more hours in the office. Living around the office would make things easier for her. Mr. Sumpter refused, and he had a friend who kept backing up his decision. Disappointed, she let the matter go, but not without dire consequences. Firstly, a resentment has grown for her husband. Even though she had tried to suppress it, she saw no reason why her husband wanted them to continue in their far and not so comfortable two-bedroom flat as against a well-furnished and equipped duplex which was waiting for them. She assumed her position, and true to her prediction, the position was more demanding and she had to close late many times, after which she would get home late. At first, she tried to make up for it by buying food from a restaurant on her way home as dinner. Her husband, not too satisfied, played along for 2 weeks, after which he vehemently refused the method. He claimed he had never liked eating out as a result of his health, and he only managed for 2 weeks in order not to be a killjoy. He was against hiring a maid either. Mrs. Sumpter apologized and raised the issue of accommodation, which was still open. This got her husband angry the more. "Are you trying to tight-fist me into what I don't want?" he asked. Mrs. Sumpter explained to him that he wasn't the only man who would move into a staff quarters, courtesy of the wife. She mentioned many of their colleagues that had done that. Mr. Sumpter yawned, pretending to be tired. He stood up and went into the room. Mrs. Sumpter sat, looking confused. Suddenly, an idea came to mind. She got a paper and pen and wrote down some things. After that, she took her bag, went to the market, and bought foodstuff in bulk. She got home and busied herself in the kitchen all day, cooking different pots of soup. Satisfied, she went to bed. The next morning, she explained the new style to her husband after serving him food. She told him to warm food to eat at night if he was hungry and she wasn't back. He nodded. They ate together and left the house. A week later, Mrs. Sumpter had returned from the market and headed to the kitchen for her bulk cooking. Her husband rushed in and told her not to try it as he would no longer be a part of the agreement. He said he had to endure the same taste for a good 1 week and he wouldn't be a party to that anymore. Mrs. Sumpter tried to pacify him by telling him she would cook more varieties, and Mr. Sumpter would have none of it. Angry but kept calm, she went into the room and started thinking. She had always believed and could swear in the past that her husband loved her and wanted her progress. Now she can't say it boldly. She decided not to do more than what she could bear. The next week came. She put on fire to warm the pots of food she had cooked over the weekend and served him. Mr. Sumpter realized this and started nagging, telling Mrs. Sumpter that she wouldn't leave the house without doing what he wanted. Defying him, Mrs. Sumpter walked out on him. It came as a shock to him because he had never experienced that from her. He sat down, biting his lips and tapping his feet. His friend, whom he reported to, had told him to send her packing. He has been hesitant because he doesn't know the best accusation that would be good for the media. He needed something to tell people who would definitely ask him why he sent his wife away. Mrs. Sumpter was a good woman in that neighborhood, known to all and sundry, so it occurred to him that he needed a strong reason to break his marriage. Mrs. Sumpter walked into the flat late in the evening. Her husband was sitting in the living room, looking displeased. Mrs. Sumpter greeted him and went into the house. Mr. Sumpter called her, asking her if she didn't deem it fit to ask if he had eaten. "Have you eaten?" Mrs. Sumpter asked carelessly and went inside, leaving a shocked Mr. Sumpter staring at her. Some days later, Mr. Sumpter brought in a project discussion before his wife. He wanted to embark on a major project, and he had always discussed it with his wife. While discussing the matter, Mr. Sumpter had noticed something different about how she handled the discussion. She has brought in a lot of administrative approach, starting from getting the documentation of the process right, budget allocation, how to source for the best task for the job, etc. She didn't plan to be like that. Her new role at work had rubbed off on her, so she brought the same project approach home. Mr. Sumpter looked at her with disgust as she was doing the breakdown of the project. He had always believed his wife had been showing off since she assumed her new role. This was another proof of what was on his mind. Mr. Sumpter, annoyed, sought his friend's advice on how to execute the project. His friend advised him on what to do and even gave him some contacts of service providers to call. He made half of the payment to the service providers. At this stage, he was no longer talking to his wife. There has been less noise, but the tension between them grew. Mr. Sumpter continued the project until halfway, when he realized that the materials he had been supplied for the project were fake. As he started noticing a huge crack on the structure, he couldn't reach the suppliers and they were no longer accessible like before. When he brought in an expert who took another look into the damage, he told Mr. Sumpter that he would have to start all over again because continuation would be dangerous. He then went ahead to school Mr. Sumpter on how he should have executed the project, the paperwork and implementation. He outlined many of the things his wife had mentioned in their conversation that day that annoyed him. He bent his head in regret because he knew his pride had done him dirty. The amount he needed to restart the project ran into millions. When his wife got home later in the evening, he started throwing tantrums. He knew he owed her an apology, but he wanted to suppress her into doing the apology. He nagged at the visibly tired wife about how the food he ate as dinner had no salt. He accused her of not having time for him since he assumed office and called her an arrogant woman. Mrs. Sumpter, not saying a word, went into the room, got a traveling bag, packed her things, and made for the door. Shocked, Mr. Sumpter intercepted her and asked her where she was going. She told him to leave her presence and declared she was done with the marriage. According to her, marriage had shown her no form of care except massive stress for the last 4 months. She had gone to the hospital earlier that day, and the doctor had declared her blood pressure was very high. "Oh, you are leaving me for a rich man that you have now found. You all are the same. When I stayed with your broke ass years, leaving me didn't cross your mind. Now you are doing well. I suddenly am not good for you again. You changed from the woman I married," he accused her. "Oh no, you changed. When I married you, I married a caring and loving man, not the beast standing before me now. Since I assumed this office, not once have you asked me how I am and how I have been coping with the challenges of my new position. All you have done is throw tantrums like a child and add to my stress level. You said I changed. The changes you saw are changes that were needed to sustain me in my new position. Try having a massive promotion and see if you will still do things the same way you've been doing them," she said. "For the records, I saw how you were swindled by the thieves you trusted. You tossed my professional advice aside, and I am happy you are learning a bitter lesson. That session I had with you, giving you a sound professional advice, wouldn't have cost you less than 200,000 naira if you were an outsider," she said, and left the house. Just then, it dawned on Mr. Sumpter that he was in a deep trouble. For a good 3 days, he lost sleep over her absence. He had anticipated sending her out, but he didn't anticipate missing her this much. He lost his appetite to eat, despite the fact that his fridge had many bowls of food that his wife had cooked. Realizing he had been immature, he went to his wife's office many times to apologize. In fact, he didn't gain access to her office until the 4th visit. The receptionist kept telling him he needed to get an appointment, and not even his tale of being the madam changed her mind. During those days he went there, he had noticed how big his wife was in that office. She had office assistants going in and out of the office. The accountant and several personnel frequented her office, and he saw the honor with which they approached the office. It occurred to him that he had gold in his house, but he treated her like trash. The day he finally got to talk to her in the office, she was seated majestically in a really big and enchanting office. She gave him 5 minutes as she had many visitors waiting for her. Mr. Sumpter apologized to her, telling her it was the devil. Unimpressed, Mrs. Sumpter told him his time was up. When she had the intercom ring from her secretary, Mr. Sumpter left sadly. 3 days later, he got back home and saw his wife in the room, arranging her clothes back into the wardrobe. "Welcome, honey," she said as she continued unpacking. Shocked and not knowing what to say, Mr. Sumpter went and hugged her.